The rain was not a sound so much as it was a weight. It pressed against the windows of the cottage, a relentless rhythmic drumming that made the glass feel thin and the world outside feel infinite. I stood in the kitchen, the linoleum cold against the arches of my feet, and watched the way the yellow light from the overhead bulb caught the steam rising from a cup of tea I had no intention of drinking. Everything in that room was a sharp angle: the edge of the counter, the frame of the back door, the silence that had grown between us over the last 3 months until it was a physical barrier I had to navigate every time I wanted to reach for a spoon or a towel. I looked at the small bronze key sitting on the table. It was heavy, ornate, a relic from the old lighthouse where we had spent our first summer. To me, seeing it there in the center of the scarred wood felt like a finality. It was a period at the end of a sentence I hadn't been brave enough to finish. I thought, this is her way of telling me the space is no longer mine. She is giving me back the only thing that tied us to a shared future. I picked it up, and the metal felt like ice. I didn't cry. I didn't have the breath for it. I simply walked to the coat rack, pulled on my yellow slicker, and stepped out into the deluge. I told myself I was doing the kind thing. I was leaving before she had to ask me to go. I was protecting her from the burden of my presence, from the way I seemed to drain the color out of her rooms lately. I walked down the gravel path, the sound of my own footsteps swallowed by the storm, and I believed with every fiber of my being that I was finally giving her the freedom she had been too polite to demand. The rain was a song I had forgotten how to sing. I sat on the top step of the stairs, hidden in the shadows of the landing, and watched her through the banister. She looked like a ghost in the harsh kitchen light, all pale skin and dark, hollow eyes. I had left the lighthouse key on the table an hour ago, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. It was the only thing I had left to give her that meant anything. It was a promise. It was me saying, I know we are lost in this house, so let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back to the place where the light actually works. I waited for her to see it, to pick it up and turn toward the stairs, to call my name and tell me we could try one more time. Instead, I watched her fingers close around it with a kind of grim desperation. I watched her face go stony and cold, a mask of iron I couldn't break through. And then, she put on her coat. She didn't look up. She didn't check to see if I was watching. She just opened the door and let the storm take her. The sound of the latch clicking shut was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I stayed on the stairs for a long time, the wood biting into my thighs, wondering how someone could take a gesture of absolute surrender and turn it into a reason to walk away. I thought I was building a bridge, but all I had done was hand her the map to the exit. She wanted to be gone. That was the only truth I could see in the empty kitchen below me. They were both right. They were both wrong. This is how it started. Subscribe to the channel for more stories about the spaces between us. Your support helps these voices reach the people who need them most. Now let's go back to the beginning, to the year before the rain never stopped. The art gallery smelled of expensive cedar and the kind of wine that makes your teeth feel dry. I hated it. I hated the way the lights were positioned to make the canvases look more important than they were, and I hated the way people whispered as if they were in a cathedral. I was standing in front of a painting of a gray sea, a piece that was trying far too hard to be profound, when I felt a shift in the air beside me. It wasn't a movement I heard, it was a sudden warmth, a displacement of the sterile gallery chill. I didn't turn around. I focused on a specific brushstroke, a jagged line of white foam that looked like a scar. It looks like it's breathing, a voice said. It was a low voice, steady and grounded, with a slight rasp that suggested she didn't use it often. I finally looked. She was taller than me, wearing a coat that looked like it had seen better decades, and boots that still had a light dusting of dried mud on the soles. She didn't belong here either. That was the first thing I noticed. The second was her eyes, a startling clear amber that seemed to take in everything without judgment. I felt a sudden, sharp need to be seen by those eyes. It was an impulse I usually suppressed, a flare of vanity or perhaps just a hunger for connection that I had spent years starving. I adjusted my glasses, my fingers trembling just enough for the plastic to click against the bridge of my nose. It looks like it's drowning, I countered, my voice sounding more formal than I intended. I wanted to sound sophisticated, but I probably just sounded cold. I saw her flinch, just a millimeter of a movement in her shoulders, and I immediately regretted the tone. I wanted to reach out and soften the air between us, but I didn't know how. She looked like a porcelain doll someone had left in the freezer. That was my first thought when I saw her at the gallery. She was so composed, so perfectly put together in her charcoal turtleneck and her neat pinned-back hair, that I felt like a landslide standing next to her. I had come to the gallery because my sister was the curator, and she had practically dragged me there by my collar, promising me free booze and a chance to look like a civilized human being for once. I was bored until I saw the woman in front of the sea painting. She wasn't just looking at the art, she was dissecting it. Her gaze was so intense it made my own skin prickle. When I spoke to her, I was trying to be friendly, trying to bridge the gap between my mud-caked boots and her polished shoes. But when she spoke back, her voice was like a shard of glass. "It looks like it's drowning," she said. It felt like a rebuke. It felt like she was telling me I was shallow for seeing life where there was only death. I felt a familiar heat crawl up my neck, the old shame of being the girl who noticed the wrong things, the girl who was always a bit too loud, a bit too much, a bit too messy for polite company. I wanted to walk away right then, to go back to my studio where the only things that judged me were the blocks of stone I carved into shapes. But then she adjusted her glasses and I saw her hand shake. It was the smallest thing, a tiny tremor in her fingers, and suddenly she didn't look like a porcelain doll anymore. She looked like someone who was holding her breath. I decided to stay. I decided to see how long she could hold it. We ended up at a diner 3 blocks away because the gallery ran out of the dry wine, and neither of us wanted to go home yet. The diner was the opposite of the gallery. It was bright, loud, and smelled of onions and old grease. We sat in a booth with cracked red vinyl that stuck to the back of my legs. I watched her order a black coffee and a side of fries, and I felt a strange, fluttering panic in my chest. I hadn't been on a date in 2 years. I wasn't even sure if this was a date. It felt more like a collision. I tried to tell her about my work at the university, about the way I studied the migration patterns of birds, and how I spent my days looking through binoculars at things that were always trying to get away from me. I thought I was being interesting, sharing the part of my life that had the most beauty. But as I talked, I saw her expression grow distant. She started to fidget with a salt shaker, sliding it back and forth across the table. I realized I was talking too much. I was being the boring academic, the woman who lived in her head because the world was too loud. I shut up abruptly, mid-sentence, the silence falling between us like a heavy velvet curtain. I waited for her to say something, to excuse herself and leave. I looked down at my hands and noticed a smudge of ink on my thumb. I felt small. I felt like a specimen under a microscope. She talked about birds like they were poetry. I sat there, mesmerized by the way her mouth moved when she said words like murmuration and thermal updraft. I didn't know anything about birds, but I liked the way she loved them. I liked the way her whole face transformed when she described the flight of a hawk. But then she stopped. She just stopped in the middle of a thought about migration, and the light in her eyes went out. She looked at her hands as if she were ashamed of them. I realized I had been too quiet. I was so busy listening to the music of her voice that I had forgotten to play my part in the conversation. I wanted to tell her that I loved the sound of her brain working, but the words felt too big, too heavy for a diner booth at 11 o'clock at night. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I reached across the table and touched her wrist. Just a light pressure, a physical anchor. I meant it as a way of saying, "Keep going, I'm here." But the second my skin touched hers, she jerked back as if I had burned her. Her eyes went wide and she started apologizing, stumbling over her words, gathering her purse. I felt a cold knot of rejection tighten in my stomach. I had overstepped. I was the messy girl again, the one who didn't know the rules of touch. I had scared her off with my bluntness, my lack of finesse. I watched her pay the check before I could even reach for my wallet, and I felt the distance between us grow by miles in a matter of seconds. The touch was like an electric shock. I wasn't expecting it. I had been so deep in my own head, so convinced of my own inadequacy, that when her fingers brushed my wrist, my entire nervous system went into a defensive crouch. It wasn't that I didn't want her to touch me. It was that I wanted it too much, and the suddenness of it felt like a breach in my armor. I saw the look on her face, the way her eyes clouded over and her hand retreated as if she'd touched a hot stove, and I knew I had ruined it. I had acted like a frightened animal, and now she thought I was repulsed by her. I tried to fix it, but my mouth wouldn't work. I paid the bill because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. I wanted to show her I could be responsible, that I wasn't a total disaster, but I think I just looked like I was in a hurry to get away from her. We walked to the subway in a silence that felt like a funeral. When we reached the entrance to the station, I turned to her, the wind whipping my hair across my face. I wanted to ask for her number. I wanted to tell her that the birds were nothing compared to the way she looked in the diner light. But I saw her looking at the ground, her jaw set, and I thought, she's already gone. She's just waiting for the polite moment to leave. So I just said good night and walked down the stairs. I cried the whole way home on the train, hidden behind a book I wasn't reading, mourning a woman I had known for exactly 3 hours. I stood at the subway entrance for 10 minutes after she disappeared. The wind was biting, but I didn't feel it. I was replaying the night in my head, searching for the moment I had lost her. I thought it was the touch. I thought it was the mud on my boots. I thought it was the fact that I didn't know the difference between a hawk and a heron. I went back to my studio and threw a tarp over the piece I was working on. It was a sculpture of 2 hands reaching for each other, and it felt like a mockery. I didn't sleep. I stayed up and drank stale coffee, waiting for the sun to come up so I could pretend to be a person again. 3 days later, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. I found a book about the migration of Arctic terns. It made me think of the way you described the wind. I'm sorry I was so abrupt at the subway. I'm not very good at this. I stared at the screen until the light dimmed. She wasn't repulsed. She was just as terrified as I was. I felt a surge of hope so violent it made me dizzy. I typed back, I'm not very good at this either. Do you want to not be good at it together at the lighthouse this weekend? I held my breath until the reply came. Yes, please. The lighthouse was a skeletal finger pointing at a bruised sky. It sat on a jagged spit of land that felt like the end of the world, and for that first summer, it was our world. We moved in with nothing but 2 suitcases, a crate of books, and a collection of carving tools that made the local hardware store owner look at us with deep suspicion. The rooms were circular, which meant there were no corners to hide in. Everything was visible. Everything was shared. I loved it. I loved the way the morning light would spiral down the central staircase, catching the dust motes in a golden dance. I loved the way Elena smelled of stone dust and peppermint tea, but I was always waiting for the ceiling to fall. I spent my days on the balcony with my binoculars, tracking the gulls, but my mind was always inside the room with her. I would watch her work, the way her muscles bunched in her back as she swung a mallet, the way she would bite her lip in concentration, and I would feel a love so intense it felt like a physical weight in my lungs. I wanted to tell her, but I was afraid that if I said the words, they would be too heavy for the old floorboards. So I did things instead. I made sure her water glass was always full. I sharpened her chisels when she was sleeping. I kept the kitchen organized with a military precision that I thought was helpful. I thought I was creating a sanctuary for her. I thought I was showing her that I could be the steady thing in her chaotic life. The lighthouse was a beautiful prison. I loved Maya, I did, but living with her was like living inside a clock. Everything had a place. Everything had a time. If I left a coffee mug on the windowsill, it would be moved to the coaster within 5 minutes. If I left my boots by the door, they were tucked into the rack before I could even take off my coat. I knew she meant well. I knew she was trying to take care of me, but sometimes I felt like I was being erased by her neatness. I felt like a smudge on a masterpiece. I missed the mess of my old studio. I missed the way the world felt when it wasn't being constantly categorized and filed away. One afternoon I was working on a particularly difficult piece of marble, trying to find the curve of a shoulder in the stone, and I was covered in white dust. Maya came in with a tray of sliced apples and cheese. She looked at the floor, at the chips of stone and the dust, and I saw that familiar flicker of anxiety in her eyes. She didn't say anything. She just set the tray down and started picking up the larger pieces of marble near my feet. It felt like a slap. I didn't want a maid, I wanted a partner. I wanted her to look at the sculpture, not the mess. I wanted her to see the shoulder I was carving, not the dust on the floor. I dropped my mallet, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the small room. "Stop it," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. She froze, a piece of marble in her hand, and looked at me as if I had struck her. I saw her eyes fill with tears, and the anger in me died instantly, replaced by a crushing guilt. I wanted to explain that I just needed to be allowed to be messy, but she was already backing out of the room, apologizing for interrupting my process. She didn't come back for hours. I sat in the dust and the silence, realizing that the more I tried to reach for her, the more I seemed to push her into the corners of the room. I thought I was failing her. That was the only conclusion I could reach. I was too much, too controlling, too rigid. I saw the way she looked at me when I cleaned, as if I were a burden she had to endure. I started to withdraw, thinking that if I gave her more space she would be happier. I spent more time on the balcony, even when it was cold. I stopped bringing her snacks. I stopped touching her hair when she passed me in the hallway. I thought I was being respectful of her boundaries. I thought I was giving her the room she needed to breathe. But the more space I gave her, the more I felt like I was disappearing. We started having dinner in silence, the only sound the clinking of forks against plates. I would look at her and see a stranger. I would wonder if she was thinking about the gallery, about the woman who looked like a porcelain doll, and if she regretted ever inviting that woman to her lighthouse. One night, I woke up and she wasn't in bed. I went to the window and saw her down on the beach, a small figure silhouetted against the dark sea. She was throwing stones into the water. I wanted to go down there. I wanted to wrap my arms around her and tell her that I was sorry for being so difficult, but I stayed at the window, paralyzed by the fear that if I went down there, I would just be another thing she had to manage. I watched her until she came back inside, and I pretended to be asleep when she climbed back into bed. I felt her sigh, a long, shaky sound that broke my heart, and I realized we were two people living in the same house who had forgotten how to speak the same language. I was drowning in the space she gave me. Every time she pulled away, every time she moved to another room or stopped herself from touching me, I felt like a limb was being severed. I thought she was bored of me. I thought the novelty of the messy artist had worn off, and now she was just left with a woman who couldn't keep a kitchen clean or a conversation going. I went down to the beach that night because the lighthouse felt like it was shrinking. The walls were closing in, and Maya's silence was a physical weight on my chest. I threw stones into the dark water, each one a frustration I couldn't voice. I wanted her to come down. I wanted her to scream at me, to tell me I was a disaster, to tell me anything other than the polite, distant fine she gave me every morning. When I went back inside, the house was so quiet it felt haunted. I climbed into bed and felt the heat radiating from her body, just inches away, but it might as well have been a mile. I sighed, hoping she would hear it, hoping she would turn over and pull me to her, but she stayed still, her breathing deep and even, and I envied her the ability to sleep while our world was crumbling. I realized then that I was the only one fighting for us. She was already gone, tucked away in her own private world of birds and binoculars. I decided that if she wanted space, I would give her all the space in the world. I would stop trying to bridge the gap. I would let her be the porcelain doll she wanted to be. The fracture didn't happen all at once. It was a slow erosion, a series of small misreadings that built up like silt in a riverbed. The first real crack came when I got the offer for the research position in the city. It was a prestigious role, something I had worked toward for years, but it meant being away from the lighthouse for 4 days a week. I was terrified to tell Elena. I was afraid she would see it as me choosing my work over her. I waited until we were sitting on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the sky a bruised purple and orange. "I got the job," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I didn't look at her. I looked at a group of sandpipers running along the shoreline. I waited for her to tell me she didn't want me to go. I waited for her to say that we would find another way, that the lighthouse was our home. But she didn't say any of those things. She just nodded, her face unreadable in the fading light. "That's great, Maya. You've worked hard for it," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the warmth I craved. I felt a cold wave of realization wash over me. She wanted me to go. She was relieved that she would have the house to herself, that she wouldn't have to deal with my neatness or my anxiety for half the week. I told myself it was for the best. I told myself that this was the space she had been asking for. I packed my bag that night with a heavy heart, feeling like I was already a ghost in my own life. She told me she was leaving as if she were reading a weather report. "I got the job," she said, and I felt the ground fall away from under my feet. I knew about the position. I had seen the letters on the desk, but I had convinced myself she wouldn't take it. I thought she loved our life here too much to give it up for a sterile office in the city. But when she said it, she didn't even look at me. She looked at the birds. She always looked at the birds. I wanted to beg her to stay. I wanted to tell her that I would be better, that I would keep the kitchen clean, that I would be the partner she deserved if she just didn't leave me alone in this big, empty tower. But I saw the way she was already pulled back into herself, the way her posture was stiff and defensive. I thought, she's doing this to get away from me. She's found a way to leave without having to say the words. If I ask her to stay, I'm just being selfish. I'm just holding her back from the life she clearly wants more than this one. So I lied. I told her I was happy for her. I told her it was a great opportunity. I watched her pack her bag, and every item she folded felt like a brick being added to the wall between us. I wanted to scream, but I just sat on the bed and watched her, my heart breaking in slow motion. I realized that I had become a burden to her, a distraction from her real life. I decided right then that I wouldn't be the one to break the silence. If she wanted to go, I would let her go with her dignity intact. The city was a gray blur of noise and transit. I hated the apartment I rented, a small square box with white walls and a view of a brick alleyway. I spent my days in the lab, staring into microscopes and typing data into spreadsheets, and my nights staring at the phone, waiting for a text that never came. When I did go back to the lighthouse on the weekends, it was worse. Elena had transformed the space. There were blocks of stone in the living room now. There was dust on the bookshelves. The kitchen was a chaos of half-finished meals and unwashed glasses. I felt like an intruder. I would spend my Saturdays cleaning, trying to restore some order to the house, thinking I was helping her. I thought, she's so busy with her work that she's letting everything fall apart. I'll take care of the house so she can focus. I thought I was being supportive. But when she would come in and see me with a vacuum or a sponge, she would just turn around and walk back out. She wouldn't even look at the rooms I had scrubbed. I felt like I was being punished for caring. I felt like a nuisance. One weekend, I found a small sculpture on the table, a bird with a broken wing carved from dark basalt. It was beautiful, but it was also devastating. I touched the jagged edge of the wing and felt a sob rise in my throat. I thought it was a message. I thought she was telling me that I had broken her, that our love was a crippled thing. I left the house that Sunday without saying goodbye, convinced that every time I returned, I was just making her more miserable. The weekends were a nightmare of performance and resentment. She would come back from the city and immediately start judging me. She wouldn't say it, but I could see it in the way she looked at the house. She would start cleaning as soon as she dropped her bag, as if my presence had contaminated the place. It felt like she was trying to scrub me out of the lighthouse. I started leaving my work out on purpose, leaving the dust and the chips of stone where they fell, a desperate attempt to say, I am still here, this is still my home. But she just cleaned around me. She treated me like a difficult child or a messy roommate. When I carved the bird with the broken wing, I was thinking of her. I was thinking of the way she looked when she was tired, the way she seemed to be carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. I wanted to give it to her as a peace offering, a way of saying, I see your pain. But when I saw her touching it, her face was full of pity. I thought, she thinks I'm broken. She thinks I'm something that needs to be fixed or filed away. I couldn't stand the look on her face, so I left. I went to the pub in town and drank until the world stopped spinning. When I came back, she was gone. No note, no text, just a clean kitchen and a cold bed. I realized then that we weren't a couple anymore. We were two people sharing a ghost story. The almost convergence happened on a Tuesday in late October. The wind was howling, a precursor to the winter storms that would soon lock the coast in ice. I had driven down from the city on a whim, unable to bear the silence of my apartment for one more night. I arrived at the lighthouse at 10 o'clock, my heart hammering. I had a speech prepared. I was going to tell her that I didn't care about the job, that I didn't care about the neatness, that I just wanted to be in the same room as her again. I walked through the door, and the house was warm. There was music playing, something soft and instrumental that I didn't recognize. Elena was in the kitchen, her back to me. She was wearing one of my old sweaters, the sleeves pushed up to her elbows. She looked so small, so fragile, that I almost went to her right then. But then I saw what she was doing. She was packing a box. My books, my binoculars, the small framed photo of my parents. She was putting my life into a cardboard container. I felt the air leave my lungs. I thought, she's finally doing it. She's packing me up. She's done waiting for me to leave on my own. I didn't say a word. I just turned around and walked back out into the night. I sat in my car for 3 hours, watching the light in the kitchen window, waiting for her to come out and find me. She never did. I drove back to the city at 2 a.m, the road a blur of tears and rain, convinced that I had finally received my answer. I was packing the box because the shelf had broken. That was it. A simple, stupid structural failure. I was moving her things to a safe place so they wouldn't get covered in the plaster dust that was falling from the ceiling. I was wearing her sweater because I missed her so much I could taste it, and the wool still smelled faintly of her shampoo. I heard the door open at 10 o'clock. I knew it was her. I knew the sound of her key in the lock like I knew my own heartbeat. I froze, my hands full of her books, my heart leaping into my throat. I waited for her to say something. I waited for her to come into the kitchen and tell me she was home for good. I was ready to drop everything and beg her to stay, but she didn't come in. I heard the door click shut again, and then the sound of her car engine starting. I ran to the window, but all I saw were her taillights disappearing into the fog. I didn't understand. Why would she come all this way just to leave again? I thought. She came to get the rest of her things, saw me touching them, and realized she couldn't even stand to be in the same room as me for 5 minutes. She hates me. That was the only explanation that made sense. I sat on the floor in the middle of the kitchen, surrounded by her books and the dust of the broken shelf, and I gave up. I decided that the next time I saw her, I would be the one to end it. I wouldn't let her keep breaking my heart in 10-minute increments. Which brings us back to the night of the key, the night that cracked everything open. The rain was a weight, the kitchen was a cage, and the bronze key was a death sentence. I took it from the table and I left because I thought it was the only thing left to do. I drove to the cliffside, the car rocking in the wind, and I looked at the key in my palm. It was the key to the lighthouse gallery, the place where we had first kissed, the place where we had promised to always find each other. To me it was a symbol of everything we had lost. I was going to throw it into the sea. I was going to let the ocean have the last of us. I stood at the edge of the precipice, the spray from the waves soaking through my coat, and I raised my arm to toss it, but I couldn't do it. My fingers wouldn't let go. I realized even now, even with the silence and the space and the misunderstanding, I still wanted to be found. I turned around, and there she was. She was standing by her truck, her hair plastered to her face, her eyes wide and terrified. She had followed me. For the first time in a year, we were looking at each other without the armor of our own stories. I followed her because I was a coward who had finally run out of places to hide. When I saw the car pull away, I didn't stop to think. I just grabbed my keys and drove. I knew where she was going. I knew she always went to the cliffs when the world got too loud. I saw her standing there, a small yellow-coated figure against the vast dark sky, and I thought I was watching her jump. My heart stopped. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, until I saw her arm go up. She wasn't jumping. She was throwing something. I scrambled out of the truck, screaming her name into the wind, but the storm swallowed the sound. I reached her just as she turned around. She was holding the key. Her face was a map of every hurt I had ever caused her, and for the first time, I saw it. I didn't see the porcelain doll or the rigid academic. I saw the woman who had been trying to save me while I was busy trying to save myself from her. I saw the key for what it was, not a rejection but a question. "Maya," I said, my voice breaking. "Maya, please don't." "Why did you give it back?" I asked, the words coming out in a jagged sob. I held the key out between us like a shield. "Why did you put it on the table like that? I thought you were telling me to leave." Elena stared at the bronze metal, her mouth dropping open. "I wasn't giving it back," she whispered, the rain streaming down her cheeks. "I was giving it to you. It's the key to the gallery. I spent all month cleaning it, fixing the shelves, making a space for your books. I wanted us to go there. I wanted to start over." I felt the world tilt. The kitchen, the boxes, the silence. It all shifted into a new, agonizing shape. "I thought you were packing me up," I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. "I saw you with the boxes. I thought you wanted me gone." Elena took a step toward me, her hands reaching out, hesitating, then finally closing around my shoulders. "I was fixing the shelf, Maya. I was trying to take care of your things because I didn't know how to take care of you." We stood there on the edge of the cliff, the rain pouring down on us, and the gap between our stories finally began to close. It wasn't a perfect bridge. It was messy and wet and built on a year of mistakes, but it was there. I pulled her into me, and for the first time in months, she didn't jerk away. She collapsed against my chest, her yellow slicker cold and slick, but her body underneath was warm, alive, and vibrating with the same terror I felt. "I'm so sorry," I muttered into her hair, the words tasting like salt and rain. "I'm so sorry I didn't see you. I was so busy being afraid of being too much that I became nothing at all." Maya pulled back just enough to look at me, her glasses fogged and crooked. "I thought I was protecting you by giving you space," she said. "I thought I was being kind by leaving." I laughed, a short, hysterical sound that got caught in the wind. "Kind? Maya, you were killing me." She reached up and touched my face, her fingers cold, but her touch certain. "Then let's go back," she said. "Not to the house, to the lighthouse, to the gallery." I nodded, unable to speak. We walked back to the trucks, hand in hand, the rain still falling, but the weight of it gone. We were both right. We were both wrong, but for the first time, we were telling the same story. The lighthouse was cold when we returned, but it didn't feel empty. We didn't turn on the harsh kitchen light. We lit candles, the small flames flickering in the drafty rooms, casting long, soft shadows against the curved walls. We sat on the floor of the gallery, the bronze key sitting on the rug between us. We talked. We didn't talk about the birds or the stone. We talked about the silence. We talked about the way a key can look like a door, closing to one person and a door opening to another. I told her about the tremor in my hands that night at the gallery, and she told me about the mud on her boots. We looked at the bird with the broken wing, and this time, I didn't see a message of failure. I saw a piece of her heart that she had been trying to hand to me for months. I realized that love wasn't about the absence of mess or the perfect migration of birds. It was about the willingness to stand in the rain and wait for the other person to turn around. It was about learning the language of a touch that wasn't a shock, but a homecoming. She looked at the sculpture and she smiled. It wasn't the polite, distant smile she had been giving me for a year. It was the smile from the diner, the one that made her eyes light up from the inside. "It's beautiful, Elena," she said, her voice steady. "It looks like it's healing." I reached out and took her hand, lacing my fingers with hers. The dust was still there on the floor. The kitchen was still a mess. The shelf was still broken. But as I looked at her in the candlelight, I realized that those things didn't matter. They were just the texture of a life lived together. They were the evidence that we were real, that we were present, that we were trying. I leaned in and kissed her, and it didn't feel like a collision. It felt like the matching of two accounts, the moment where the two versions of the night finally became one. We weren't suddenly perfect. We still had a year of silence to unpack, and a house to fix, and a language to learn. But as the storm finally began to taper off outside, I knew we would be okay. We were no longer missing each other by inches. We were right here. I watched the candle flame reflect in her amber eyes, and I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. The geometry of the room felt right again. The angles were gone, replaced by the soft, familiar curve of the lighthouse walls. I thought about the birds I studied, how they traveled thousands of miles across open oceans, guided by nothing but a feeling in their bones and the pull of the earth. They got lost sometimes. They got blown off course by storms just like this one, but they always kept flying. They always looked for the shore. I looked at Elena, at the woman who had followed me into the dark, and I realized that she was my shore. I was no longer a specimen under a microscope. I was a woman who was loved, in all my rigidity and my neatness and my fear. I picked up the bronze key and handed it back to her. "Keep it," I said, "so you can always let me in." She took it, her thumb tracing the pattern of the metal, and she nodded. "Always," she promised. And for the first time I believed her without reservation. The rain had stopped, the world was quiet, and we were finally home. They stood together at the window as the first light of dawn began to bleed across the horizon. The sky was no longer bruised. It was a pale, clear blue, the color of a fresh start. The ocean below was calm, the waves lapping gently against the jagged rocks. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence between them was no longer a wall. It was a shared breath. They had lived through the same night and come away with two different stories. But in the end, they had found the truth in the gap. They had learned that love is not a single narrative, but a constant translation. It is the work of two people trying to see the same horizon through different eyes. And as the sun rose over the lighthouse, casting a long golden shadow across the spit of land, they turned away from the window and toward each other, ready to begin the long, beautiful task of telling the rest of their story together. It wouldn't be easy. There would be more storms, more misreadings, more moments where the silence felt too heavy. But they knew now that as long as they kept talking, as long as they kept reaching, they would never be lost again. They were both right, they were both wrong, and they were both, finally, exactly where they were meant to be.